Well, thank you, Sergio. There's no way I can follow you, but I am inspired that you were able to model all those complex relationships, and we're going to talk about other relationships between different stakeholders. Since this conference is in honor of Howard Rafa, I thought I'd put his picture up again and mention that Howard Rafa and Ralph Keeney advise us to make smart choices and to use value-focused thinking. And those are books. The first one is co-authored by them and another author, and then the second one is just by Ralph. So we want to think about what we value, and as we express what we value in our objectives. A key component of, I'm going to have to use my glasses, I think, here. A key component of systems analysis is examining the perspectives and actions of multiple stakeholders. Constructing a hierarchy of objectives for stakeholders provides decision insights. And here's just a stylized diagram of a hierarchy of objectives, just a tree, sometimes called a value tree. Understanding these objectives of different stakeholders can help us identify mutually agreeable alternatives, foresee opposition to decisions, design new and better alternatives, and understand the evolution of past decisions from multiple perspectives. So we can use these tools to look at past decisions and learn from them, or to aid current decisions, or to help us understand what might happen if we're trying to roll out some sort of new policy for the future, and we want to anticipate what might happen. Sometimes one objectives hierarchy is enough to characterize the set of stakeholders' concerns. Differences across the stakeholders would occur in the trade-offs between the objectives or the evaluations of the performance of the alternatives on the objectives. So I'm going to give you some examples where a single objectives hierarchy has been made to represent the concerns across stakeholders. This is an example in the United States. After 9/11, there was a study convened to think about what would happen if terrorists would attack a nuclear power plant in the United States, causing a release of radioactive iodine, which causes a risk of thyroid cancer risk. If such an event would occur from terrorists or perhaps from an accident where the members of the public would be exposed to the radioactive iodine, there would be, first of all, young children or fetuses would be the ones most at risk. So pregnant mothers would need to protect their unborn children, and then their young children, the young children of families. The alternatives that were being considered by the committee that I was on, which was commissioned to study this, were to predistribute potassium iodide, which if taken in the 24 hours when you're being exposed by a plume, fallout, or perhaps by ingesting the radioactive iodine, if you take it just in that 24-hour period, it will block out the radioactive iodine. And, but if you're still exposed after another 24 hours, you have to take another pill. So you could predistribute this Ki, potassium iodide, to households, schools, hospitals, et cetera. You could do it by mail. You could do it by voluntary pickup. Different states in the United States do it different ways. You could stockpile at evacuation centers where you would receive people being evacuated from the area, or just choose not to predistribute because there's lots of other risks, and this would be something that would be a possible choice, a decision in this case. We came up with a list of objectives that could be used by different stakeholders, could be used in different regions of the United States where they would have different situations. And they were divided into two major categories: minimize radioactive iodine risk to the thyroid, for thyroid cancer risks, and minimize harm from other aspects of the incident. Because, of course, if you have a big incident in a nuclear power plant, maybe 4 or 5 days later you might have the release, and a plume a couple of days later might get to where a person was living. And so we're concerned about effects of the potassium iodide policy on other aspects, such as, does it impede evacuation? Would there be more mortality and morbidity from evacuation procedures than there would be from the potential thyroid cancer risks, et cetera? So that's an example where we looked at all different stakeholders, but we came up with just one objectives hierarchy. And this is, since we're saying the word objectives hierarchy or value tree, this is the same tree in a little bit more detail and drawn in a tree form. And again, the differences between groups could be represented in different trade-offs among objectives, different evaluations of how well each alternative would perform. And what we came up with was an Excel spreadsheet with sliders in it that allowed for dynamic sensitivity analysis, where you could change the possible additive trade-off weights that you put on the objectives for different scenarios that different regions might face. Another example is the merger of ORSA and TIMS to become INFORMS. So after World War II, operations research techniques were now going to be adapted to use throughout society. And we had the Operations Research Society of America in the United States and the Institute of Management Sciences. And for about 40 years, they were separate organizations that were often managing joint publications, joint conferences, and there came a time in the 90s when we were asking, well, maybe we should merge. And for that, we again talked to many, many different stakeholders and came up with an objectives hierarchy and a top-down approach where the highest level objectives are listed here, and then they are subdivided further and further. And the way that we constructed it was by talking to many, many different stakeholders and find out what they cared about as they wanted to have professional societies or one society that would aid them in their profession. So again, the highest level objectives would be subdivided. And this is an example in the tree structure. Well, what happened with that after analysis, the members of the two organizations separately voted to merge, and we merged, and we became the Institute for Operations Research and the Management Sciences in 1995. In other cases, you could have an objectives hierarchy that would be constructed for each of the major stakeholders. And so I put them here in red, green, and blue just to signify that there's different stakeholders that could have different structures, different kinds of concerns. And in those cases, we found that their objectives and interests are so different that they really don't fit into one objectives hierarchy. And so construction of the separate hierarchies better represents their different perspectives. This is an example from 1987 in energy policy of a study done by Ralph Keeney, Ortwin Wren, and Detlev von Winterfeld, and it was before the reunification of Germany. So this was on structuring West Germany's energy objectives. And what they did was come up with separate objectives hierarchies for different stakeholders. So this is the Bund der Deutschen Industrie, the Association of German Industries. And I know you're not going to be able to see all the details, but I just want to give you an idea that you could talk with different stakeholders, in this case planning for the energy systems for the future, and see what they were interested in. So this was just for that group. And then here's the Deutsche Katholische Kirche, the German Catholic Church, and so then they had their interests. And you can imagine if you talk to those two different stakeholder groups at first, they're going to use different kinds of terms, different things that they're interested in. Then after doing this for a number of other groups, they finally came up with a combined hierarchy, which again, I know you can't see. This is the top of the tree, and then the bottom of the tree, the value tree, or objectives hierarchy, I'm using that term. And this kind of structuring of objectives may stop at the point of just structuring objectives because it helps in designing the next steps in a policy planning procedure. Or you can sometimes go farther and come up with quantification, weights on objectives, a value model, and we heard a lot about that in the Howard Rafa session yesterday. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about an example of the StarKist tuna fishing decision. This is a story with three major stakeholders. I did it with a former doctoral student, Monica Vin, who is a professor at University of Victoria in Canada now, and her main research in business strategy is trying to figure out how you can do what's good for the environment and good for business at the same time, trying to balance the two often divergent stakeholders to come up with actions that are good for the world, so sustainability. And This story has StarKist, which was a leading US company for tuna fish for human consumption. The Earth Island Institute, which is trying to protect marine mammals, particularly in this case dolphins. And the tuna fishing fleet, which was a fishing fleet headquartered in San Diego of people of Portuguese descent. This community was a very active and tight-knit community of fishing people. And they had diametrically opposed interests in this case. So the problem is that in the Pacific Ocean, if you are a big boat, you go out with a big net, these purse seine nets, so-called purse seine nets, like purse strings that'll pull the strings in to close the net once you get your haul of fish inside. When you're doing that, it's very common that the dolphins are swimming with the tuna. Dolphins are air-breathing mammals. If you get them caught in a net below water and they can't breathe, they will suffocate and drown. Also, if you catch them and pull them up into the with the winches and everything, you could also hurt them if they haven't drowned. And so you're putting these intelligent marine mammals at risk to try to catch the tuna fish. So in the United States, there were regulations about how many dolphins could be killed as side outcomes of the tuna fishing operations. So there were legal quotas that were set. And one possibility for the canner, so StarKist is a cannery, for their supply chain, where they are purchasing from their suppliers, which is the Portuguese fishing fleet, would be to maintain the legal quota. So just keep the current practices. The current practices were that there were observers going out on the boats from the environmental group and observing, trying to make sure that they didn't kill any dolphins. They would have frogmen jump into the water along with the tuna and the dolphins, trying to get the dolphins out of the nets before they would pull the nets in. They could try to do more limited mortality efforts, so try to change the nets somehow, try to change the policy somehow, trying to avoid killing the dolphins. Or zero mortality. And zero mortality was just, there was going to be no fishing associated with setting nets on dolphins. What that really meant was that the canner was not going to buy any tuna caught in the Pacific Ocean coming into California because all of the tuna that are out there are going to have dolphins at risk if they're going to be caught in these big nets. Okay, so those are the three options. Not surprisingly, the different stakeholders felt very differently about the different alternatives. So this is for the fishing fleet, this Portuguese descent fishing fleet, and they have a set of objectives. We came up with these objectives by Monica interviewed and had internal documents from all of the different stakeholders. So the columns are the alternatives, the rows are the objectives, and there's a quick color coding where the pluses or the greens are good, like green light, go, that's good. From the perspective of the fishing fleet, which is keeping the status quo, is overall pretty good. Going dolphin safe, the far right hand, is pretty red, like red light, stop. It's bad or negative from the perspective of the fishing fleet. The middle one is still relatively green. They were still going to be in business, being able to go out and catch the dolphins, catch the tuna, even though it was at risk to dolphins, and try to get rid of more mortality or morbidity risks to the dolphins. Well, the environmental interest groups look different. So like if we go back and forth, let's see if I can go back and forth. Okay, so here for the, whoops, no, I'm not going back. Okay, so, well, anyway, they look different. The environmental interest groups want to go dolphin safe, so their far right column is very green. The fishing fleet's far right column was very red. This is a typical situation where you've got diametrically opposed interests of the different stakeholders by not just arguing on the three main alternatives, like hey, there should be no tuna caught in the Pacific Ocean, or there should be tuna caught in the Pacific Ocean. By getting to understand the objectives of the different stakeholders, it's possible that we might be able to find some common area of agreement, or it may be that it's still the case that when the final decision is going to be made, one side's going to win, one side's going to lose, but we're going to understand much more about what their objectives are and understand why they are objecting. So the marine mammals, the group that's trying to protect the marine mammals, if you look at status quo, you have quite a few reds there on the left-hand column of the status quo. But then at the bottom, there's some sort of green, which is they're getting positive media coverage. They got actor George C. Scott to narrate a video, which is called Where Have All the Dolphins Gone? This was talking about what was happening and showing graphic photographs of dolphins getting caught in the nets and being pulled up and having morbidity or mortality occur. And they were threatening, when Earth Day was going to come, they were going to have a massive boycott of all StarKist tuna. So they were getting lots and lots of media attention. And so you could imagine that for their long-term interests, it was still sort of good that this issue was out there and they were getting their name out there. Okay, so now here's the objectives hierarchy for StarKist, and we actually constructed them for early in the process and later in the process, but this is sort of at the end, which is this big crisis mode, where StarKist is worried that there's going to be a big consumer boycott, and the idea of tuna fish, canned tuna fish, is going to be tainted in the mind of a generation as they know about it and think about, oh, there might be some dolphins inside the tuna. And it certainly was in the news. For us, it was in cartoons, it was in movies, you know, lots of different places that this issue had made it into the popular media. So from their perspective at this final stage, the executives went behind closed doors and weighed what decision that they should make. And they were really looking at, are we going to survive as a firm? Can we sustain our profitability? Can we minimize interference from government regulation? This is the US government. And can we maintain organizational legitimacy? So they really were talking not in the same way they would talk normally, and you know, how are we running our business, and what are our revenues, what are our costs, but starting to look in much more detail based on the interactions and the evolution of this decision situation. And eventually, they chose to not go with the red, which is keeping the status quo, and going dolphin safe, which is the far right column, which started to appear much more green to them. So their decision was to come up with the dolphin safe policy in 1991. StarKist will not buy any tuna caught in association with dolphins in the eastern tropical Pacific, so off of our coast in California. Oops. Okay, well, so the end of that story, the Portuguese fishing fleet died out, and so they basically lost their community, lost their sustenance, because they could not supply anymore to StarKist, and the other two major tuna fishing canneries in the United States also quickly followed, making dolphin-safe symbols for their cans, just as StarKist had done. Okay, next I'm going to show you another case, which is the Home Depot case. This is a case in San Juan Capistrano, California. San Juan Capistrano is a place where newly sainted Father Sarah founded one of the missions that are all along California. And so it's a historical place with a historical mission, very small town, very, very long and old town from a California perspective. And some people felt threatened by a big box retailer for home products, which is the Home Depot, being possibly sited into this town. So Home Depot wanted to buy some more land from the city because they already had some land and they wanted to build a Home Depot store. And the question was, should the city sell it to Home Depot? The city would get money, but some people thought that they would lose on a lot of other dimensions if this big box store came in. So they're worried about traffic jams, pollution, image, the smaller retail outlets were all concerned. So in this case, we had a number of possible alternatives, and this is actually a case, it's a real case that occurred in San Juan Capistrano, and a real vote that was taken by the people that lived there. but it's also now been developed into a class case, so I'm just going to show you the kinds of tools that we use for aiding decision making. So they could build the Home Depot, so basically sell the land to the Home Depot so they could build it. Don't develop the land, just leave it undeveloped. Build a recreational vehicle park or specialty retail. And then the stakeholders are listed here. The city of San Juan Capistrano, the city council had to decide whether or not they were going to sell the land, but they decided to ask the voters, the residents that could vote, to give them, in a referendum, advice on this. There were the competing local small businesses, like a small hardware store that would probably lose out if Home Depot came. Complementary local small businesses, like maybe McDonald's, could be on the corner, and all of the workers that are going to go build houses or work on houses could go to McDonald's, and that would be complementary. Home Depot, the nearby residents that would be near the big box store, and then other area residents who might get the convenience of going to the store but not be bothered by the traffic or the noise. We construct spreadsheets that allow filling in of the objectives in the rows and filling in the alternatives in the columns, and then coming up with weights, and we use additive weights, assuming certain independence conditions hold, like Ralph Keeney talked about in his talk yesterday. You can get an additive model, and the weights are interpreted as in what we call a swing weight interpretation, which is if you have a certain increment of improvement on one objective and a certain increment of improvement on another objective. So we always look at how much improvement there is on one versus how much there is on another to say, you know, like, would it be worth 3 more minutes of commute if you got less noise, so you could sleep at night or something? And you'd have to have a measure of exactly what the amount of noise would be. Or, for example, you'd have more people employed, so 50 more people employed, but you'd have 5 minutes more of commute. So you'd be trying to trade off the ranges of changes on different objectives to be able to get the weights. And so then what happens is we made these kinds of generic spreadsheets where for whatever decision you might be trying to model, you can fill in everything. And once you start filling in the spreadsheet, then you can get a graph of the results, and you also get the objectives hierarchy drawn. So for example, we're trying to identify a group's objectives. So for example, we're talking about the city and okay, so I see my yellow now. The city, and say we want to promote the convenience of shopping. You type it in one place, it also shows up in the tree. And then filling in the swing weights with the sliders and filling in scores of how good each alternative is on each objective. We can then think about doing dynamic sensitivity analysis by moving sliders on weights. So here in the red circle, I've got some weights. Up at the top, we've got a lot of hundreds, which is the highest level of raw swing weight. And we get the results from that set of objective weights and set of scores, value ratings. And so in this case, the specialty retail is the best. But if I now move the sliders by changing the weights, then it turns out that you can see that now another graph gets higher, another bar gets higher, and so now not developing the land is better. So if you can think about, well, what might happen, we now get all of the information from all of the stakeholders and on all of the alternatives. Higher numbers are better, so the green means the highest score for each of them. And then you can get graphs showing for each of the stakeholders what their preferences are. Higher numbers are better. And they differ, of course. And we can examine how fair an alternative is from the perspective of each stakeholder based on their overall value for the alternative. And so we can take the same data and now look at each of the alternatives, like don't develop the land. It's the green circle. They're sort of closer, so that's one measure of fairness, that their preferences for overall value are closer. And then Home Depot, they're more divergent, so that's the red circle. So that would just be one measure of fairness that you could look at with this multiple stakeholder perspective. And the outcome is the voters voted no, and there is no Home Depot in the city. So we've modeled decisions under certainty, no probabilistic states of nature, but of course we can do that, and we could have decision trees with chance nodes and still have multiple objectives, multiple stakeholders. And we may disagree a lot on the probabilities, but there may be other components that there's disagreement, and this kind of modeling exercise allows us to figure it out. So a key component of systems analysis is examining the perspectives and actions of multiple stakeholders, and constructing objectives, hierarchies of objectives for these stakeholders provides decision insights. That's all.